Stephen Vantassel. You're listening to Living the Wildlife, discussing all things related to vertebrate pest control as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek podcast with Living the Wildlife podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. Glad to have you on board again, as always. I hope your week went well. I had a pretty good week, all things considered. Was involved in providing some training recently, so I kind of enjoy that part of my work. So it was good to travel a little bit and get some of that done. So I was very pleased to see that. So I received a request recently from an individual who noted that I talked about, let me get back. I got a little off track here. Hey, make sure you subscribe to the channel, ring the bell. You can also be sure that you subscribe. We want you to subscribe to the channel. Do tell us, and if you can give us a thumbs up on our channel, that we would definitely appreciate that. You can also join us on Facebook at the Pest Geek Podcast family. We'd be glad to have you there. It's a place where you can talk about your victories, your triumphs, and your tragedies, and also ask questions and just share, talk shop in a community, in a supportive community. You can also reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. That's wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. Looking for tips for future shows. You may have questions. You may have comments. You may be on the show. Perhaps you have a suggestion for someone that I should interview. Would love to hear all of that as well. So, as I said before, I did get an email from one of our podcast listeners, and he said, "Hey, Steve, I'm paraphrasing here, you talked about Baylisascaris procyonis, that's the raccoon roundworm, in a previous podcast," and I was very glad that he did look for it. He said, "But you didn't comment anything about latrine cleanup." And you're like, well, I think he's right. And I said, no, you're right. I did not do a podcast on that, but I did do a publication on latrine cleanup. And so I thought, given the question was raised, if he's asked this particular question, I'm really glad that he did. I appreciate that because I want to provide information and training that's going to be useful for you folks out in the field, your businesses and your lives. And we will get geeky. This is the Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife. But nevertheless, we want to always be relevant enough to try to give you something that you can use in the short term. And we are getting into that attic season, where people are having raccoons in their buildings and whatnot. So this is certainly going to be an issue that's going to come up for many of you. So let's talk a little bit about raccoon latrine cleanup. So let me go to my publication, and the title of it is, let me kind of blow it up here so you can see it a little bit easier. The title of the publication that I created was a draft proposal for an industry protocol for the cleanup of raccoon latrines. Now, I wrote this back when I was at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln because I was involved in doing some raccoon feces testing. I mean, I didn't do the specific testing. I was just doing some macro work with that. And then I was submitting samples over to our veterinary lab at the university, and they were doing the flotation. What you do is you take the feces and you kind of pulverize it and you put it in a liquid, and then you spin it, centrifuge it, and let the eggs sort of float to the surface, is my understanding, and then you put that under a microscope and you try to identify any eggs that are inside of that particular feces or that liquid. And what was interesting is that this was a company, an insurance company out of Florida at the time, and they were dealing with a problem where they were getting all these major claims to clean out attics. And so they wanted to know, are these were these actual raccoon feces? And if they were, did they actually have infective eggs? Now, I talked before in a previous podcast about the challenges with raccoon roundworm. And so let me just sort of highlight some of the elements there. Raccoon roundworm is a serious parasite. You have to generally ingest it. It's unclear whether you can ingest it through inhaling. In other words, if you were breathing a cloud of dust and then maybe those eggs got into your mouth and then you swallowed them. It's unclear whether that would be an issue, but it's certainly something we don't want to experiment with, right? So you want to be careful. When you're going into attics and areas that are contaminated with feces, you should be wearing your proper HEPA filter and respirator. You want to be careful. But what was happening is it seems that some companies were overstating kind of the risk of raccoon roundworm. And so it's important to realize that raccoon roundworm, it's not like plutonium. It doesn't have a half-life of 5,000 years or something, right? So raccoon roundworm does die. It's hard for it to die. But if it gets dry and it's in a dry environment for an extended period of time, we don't know what that time is, unfortunately, but it will desiccate. That is, it just dries out and dies. So what was happening is that the scat that we were getting, whether the roundworm eggs were dead already before we got the shipment, or whether they dried out during the shipment, it's unclear. But we only had, I think we had something like 10, maybe 15 samples that were ultimately sent to us. It's been a long time, so don't quote me on that. But we had like 1 or 2 positives among all of those submissions. Now, again, this was Florida, so Florida gets pretty hot. And if you're in an attic in Florida, I haven't been in an attic in Florida, but my assumption would be that it would be really hot, right? So hot, maybe muggy, but it's still going to be it's going to be dry inside of an attic. And that heat is going to probably be one of the reasons why those scats were not infective. In other words, even if they had roundworm eggs, the eggs were no longer infective because they desiccated out. So the point is that when we're talking about raccoon roundworm cleanup in an attic, we want to be careful because we don't know what the infective stage is of those droppings. But by the same token, we don't want to overstate the risk. So we want to be careful. We don't want to contaminate the person's house and their living space with feces. That's just gross. And remember, raccoon roundworm is not the only risk in raccoon feces. So the problem, of course, is we had no industry guidelines telling us how to do the work of the cleanup. And that is one of the things that industry is supposed to do, is that industry creates standards by which things are to be done, right? I mean, think about carpentry. I mean, it didn't go OSHA first in terms of safety and then people followed that. No, people learned what safe practices were. And then ultimately, as the industry developed, OSHA was created to ensure worker safety. Well, the same thing when it comes to carpentry practices. You didn't have zoning and building codes come first, and then the carpenter learned how to do his work. The carpenter learned how to do safe construction practices, how do you build a house so it doesn't fall down. And then the rules governing carpentry were created afterwards. Well, that's kind of where we are in this industry. Unfortunately, our industry is so scattered, and different states and wildlife control operators, as a rule, don't really like a lot of rules. They tend to be pretty independent-minded, and there's also a tendency not to standardize things, and they don't like to push for legislation. I've talked about this many times in my podcast. So we don't have any official industry protocols for how to do raccoon roundworm cleanup from raccoon latrines, right? So I decided, all right, well, let me take on this task. I've never done a quote unquote attic clean out for raccoon latrines, right? When I was in the industry, there were situations where it probably could have been done. I mean, the most I've had to do probably with just a couple of handfuls of scat. So, and that's not what we're talking about here. So let me sort of pause for a minute. If you're dealing with an attic and there's just a couple of handfuls of raccoon feces, simply take your gloved hand, put your hand in a bag, plastic bag, grab it up, grab a little bit of the insulation around it, wrap it up, tie it up, and remove it from the attic. You don't have to have a $50,000 attic clean out for just a few spots, okay? When we're talking about doing a raccoon latrine, we're talking about something where, 10, 20 square feet, right? And the insulation is trashed. Let's not make the job bigger than it has to be. But just if you have a couple of spots where you have some raccoon feces, that does not demand a full attic clean out. Okay, so let's just kind of get there. So anyways, with consultation of the research and talking to people and going to different classes that I've heard people talk about what they did, and I had this reviewed by some other people as well, as I recall, I created this proposal for how do we regulate, if we ever did regulate, how to do raccoon latrines. And this is not the final word, and I want to be very clear about that. What I wrote here was a good faith attempt to provide some systematic conversation about the process of doing a raccoon latrine cleanup, and using some technical jargon because the goal was that this would become a protocol for the industry. Okay, so this publication's available on the internet, and so if you just do a Google search or whatever internet browser you use, and just do a search, a draft proposal for an industry protocol for the cleanup of raccoon latrines. In fact, if you just simply put in Vantassel, my name, cleanup of raccoon latrines, this should probably come up. All right, and I'll try to make sure some of this information is in. Whether you're looking it up on Rumble or whether you're looking it up on YouTube, we'll try to make sure that this is going to be searchable for you. So this is the publication I did. Again, it was published in January of 2012. So here we go. So there we have a classic raccoon scat. Notice it's kind of has that Tootsie Roll type look to it. This one was obviously eating some berries, and so it has some darkness to it. And notice the disclaimer I have right here off the bat, right? This is an overview of this paper. It was presented at the 14th Wildlife Damage Management Conference. We thought our membership might find its unabridged version useful, so I did a narrower version for the Wildlife Damage Management Conference, and I said this document was not edited by the editors of the proceedings. It was simply formatted to improve its usability and match the proceedings. Okay, so here we go. There's a little abstract at the top. And so basically, I talk about how this parasitic nematode called Baylisascaris procyonis. Baylisascaris is a very common roundworm, nematode, I guess, and it's occurs in a lot of different species of animals, but raccoons are a key carrier of this particular one. That's why it's called Baylisascaris, roundworm of the raccoon. Procyonis is one of the parts of the scientific name for a raccoon, because a raccoon is called Procyon lotor in scientific terminology. So where does this parasite reside? Well, it resides in the raccoon's intestines and is shed out. The eggs are shed through the raccoon excrement. And you'll see the name Dr. Kazakos. He was probably the world's foremost scholar on raccoon roundworm, and his work, he's done the most work in this area. I don't know if there's any new researcher. I think he's retired now, but the majority of he's done the most work in this area of raccoon roundworm. So the concern, of course, with raccoon roundworm is that if you ingest it, this worm can penetrate through your abdomen or your intestine and either go into muscle and where it insists, or if it gets into your bloodstream, it can travel around to some parts of your body where you don't want it. You don't want any of this in your body, to be sure. But if it insists in muscle, then it's going to be pretty much innocuous. However, If it gets into your bloodstream, it can go into your liver, it can go into your eyes, it can go up into your brain. It can be serious. And this is what happens typically with children who have it. So it's not a common infection. It may be underdiagnosed. It's unclear. But the children who have gotten it have had some serious medical difficulties, including brain damage and the whole nine yards. It's a very tragic situation. So we don't want that to occur with our clients. We certainly don't want it to happen to ourselves. And so we need to be careful with this, okay? So the problem with this roundworm is that it's very tough. You can't kill it with ordinary disinfectants, okay? It's not like rabies where you spray some 10% bleach on it and the rabies virus is killed. Or if rabies becomes is on a dry surface and it dries out, that the virus becomes inactivated. That's not the case for raccoon roundworm. The eggs are extraordinarily durable. Dr. Kazakos, as I recall, he had some raccoon roundworm eggs in formalin, I believe for 20 years, and then he pulled them out of formalin and then cut the egg open and the worm emerged. So, which is amazing, okay? Now, but again, that's a moist environment, right? But if you put that same group of eggs in, out exposed to the sun where it's going to be dry, as long as it stays dry, those eggs are ultimately going to die. So this is the challenge that we have. They're also small. They're microscopic, but so we can't really see whether we're cleaning them out or not. So we can't really disinfect them. We can't, spray, squirt to kill the eggs. That's not going to happen. Are there products that will kill the eggs? Yes, but it's illegal to use them. Will temperature kill the eggs? The answer is yes. The eggs will perish if they're exposed to a temperature, as you can see here. Let me sort of highlight it here for you, of 144 degrees. Higher temperatures or greater heat are required if the eggs are insulated, which is obviously a problem when they're found inside attic insulation, right? So 144 degrees when they're just pure eggs, put it in a test tube and you heat it up to 104 degrees, and I think it's for a minute or so, the eggs will die. But when in an attic, you have insulating material. You have all the other debris around in the feces that will insulate and protect those eggs from the heat that's put against it. So this is a problem of these eggs are tough. So how do we clean them properly out of an attic without making the problem worse? And that's what this particular document is all about. So let me scroll down here. And so here are the proposed guidelines here. And so this document is divided up into two parts. Part 1 deals with general contractor issues, but then it focuses on cleaning up a raccoon latrine that's found in an attic or enclosed space. The second section of the document focuses on the cleanup of raccoon latrines in outdoor situations. Okay, so there's two different strategies, one for handling raccoon latrines inside of a structure and one for handling raccoon latrines outside of the structure, okay, because there's things you can do outdoors that you just can't do indoors. Okay, so obviously the most dangerous and difficult one is handling raccoon roundworm latrines or raccoon latrines inside of attics. And so basically the beginning portion of this just covers contractor generalities and obligations, various references to regulatory organizations, EPA, OSHA, of course. And by the way, OSHA, to the best of my knowledge, still doesn't have guidelines for the cleanup of raccoon toilets and attics. So we are still under the radar when it comes to OSHA. And so then, of course, you have health departments as well that are going to be involved. So you have some federal agencies, perhaps some state agencies, and then local health departments. Now, then it goes to part 3 here. 3.0, I should say, not part 3. And it says guidelines for pre-abatement planning. So in other words, you need to have an idea, what are you going to do before you do the job? And this is your requirement. You shall identify where the latrine is, how large it is, what the quantity is. You're going to be taking measurements. You're also going to establish barricades, perhaps even posting warning signs and coordinating with clients, because when you're doing this cleanup, you don't want to contaminate the client's living space. Now, what a lot of wildlife control operators do, and I think this is a really clever and appropriate idea, is they will actually not go through the attic. In other words, they won't take the debris and material through the house itself. They will punch out the end vent, or the attic vent, and they will take it directly outside, so you're not carrying that material through the house. You say, well, if you're carrying it through the house, certainly you want to be using, appropriate trash bags. You don't want things to break. But if you can't take it out of the attic directly, then you're going to have to carry it through the attic opening and carry it through the house. And you need to start putting up some barriers so that you're not contaminating a majority of the house. So this requires some work, and thankfully there are some things that take plastic sheets and some tension poles, and you basically create walls and a little tunnel for yourself to go from the attic directly outdoors. What other people do is they'll have these massive vacuum cleaners, and they'll just have it vacuumed outdoors. So there's some issues with that, and we try to discuss some of that in this particular document. So it gets a little tedious in this require, and then we have the submittal section where you're going to be writing things up for your client, and you're going to document what you're going to be doing. So there is going to be some paperwork involved here, and you're going to have things like, your fit testing. You need to be sure that your workers have proper fit testing and that they are properly authorized to work in the areas, and material data safety sheets, or even that's old now, it should be SDS sheets, of any chemicals that you're using. Because remember, feces have other problems, not just simply raccoon roundworm. Sometimes we focus on raccoon roundworm, but there are other little nasties inside feces as well, and you may want to use some sort of a disinfectant when you're up there. Well, you need to have those SDS sheets, and in some cases, some states will require you to have a pesticide license, because remember, disinfectants are pesticides. So you need to be sure that you have the proper licensing if you're using this. Otherwise, you're going to be using water, because one of the aspects of this training, of this document, talks about how you want to keep those eggs from becoming airborne. But you don't want all that dust, because the dust is going to contain other contaminants. You don't want that becoming airborne either. So sometimes when you're shoveling, you want to wet it down. You're going to have a little sprayer and just wet it down, even with some soapy water, to make sure that dust stays down while you're shoveling and putting it into contractor trash bags. Talk about site security measures. Again, this is like, oh, Stephen, you're really getting detailed here. Well, that was the goal. We wanted to try to be as comprehensive as possible, even though what elements of this you need to do at your particular job may vary, obviously. But we tried to be comprehensive so that it was a template to cover all the potential ins and outs, whether you're dealing it for an industrial site or whether you're doing it in someone's garage. Okay, so trying to cover all of that. Personal protection practices, how to protect workers, what happens if a worker gets exposed to feces, what do you do? How to clean their clothing, what happens if there's ingestion or inhalation or swallowing of the fecal material, what would happen there. We have a little bit of information. Notice how all of this is as documented as we could come up with. That is antithelmintic treatments. There is where you want to try to flush that worm out of those eggs out of your body. And then we get into sort of the meat of the material in 7.0, where we talk about work area preparation and latrine removal methods. So warning signs have to be there. We suggest having negative air pressure maintained in the area. Again, you don't want a negative air pressure means that air is moving into the attic, not out of the attic. So this way, you're not having any of that dust isn't going to be pushed out into other areas. We talked about having high efficiency particulate air filters used in negative air machines, how long they should last for you, 600 hours, for example, and projects involving contaminated soils shall generally require a minimum of 4 inches of surface oil extending out at least 12 inches on all sides of the fullest extent of the latrine's perimeter. Now, that's for obviously cleaning a latrine outside of a structure, but the same sort of principles would apply inside of an attic as well. So you're not just removing the fecal material, but you need to remove insulation beyond that And under that, you may have to go all the way to the sheetrock, depending on the situation. Sometimes the staining is so bad, you may have to do some sanding of the wood. You may have to do some steaming, whatever the case may be. But it's important to recognize that we're not sterilizing the attic. We are cleaning the attic. And so at no point should you ever be saying to a client, we're going to sterilize your attic. You cannot prove that. That's just simply, that's a liability nightmare. And to get to that level, the price would be absolutely enormous, because you'd have to do proper surveys and testing and have statistical analysis to be sure that you're sampling enough locations. It's just simply beyond the pale. So when you're preparing all this material, then we get down into the cleaning standards. And so we talk about, what do you do if the feces or latrine materials are in inaccessible areas? Like maybe the client doesn't want their wall tore out. Well, then what do you do? Then you can do things like sealing it or encapsulating it. But the client needs to be completely made aware of all this. All contaminated surface in the work area shall be wet wiped, and cleaned. All debris shall be disposed in a manner consistent with disposal guidelines of the CDC for infectious materials. Wet wiping should be done with hot soapy water, with or without 20% bleach or 1% hypochlorite. Bleach, note, does not kill the eggs. The bleach is to remove the adhesive outer coat of the eggs so that they don't stick to surfaces. And that's all listed right here. So again, you're cleaning, you're not sterilizing. Okay? You're removing the organic debris, you're wet wiping it down, and then you're replacing it with clean material. Can you vacuum? Yes, you can vacuum. However, we talk about you needing strong microparticulate vacuum. In other words, you have to have materials that are going to be proper HEPA filtered. Otherwise, you're just going to be blowing all this stuff out into the air and making things even worse. I do have a section in here talking about how large the eggs are. Let me see if I can find that. Here it is. So the Baylisascaris eggs, thankfully, are comparatively large, and that's 63 to 88 micrometers to 50 to 70 micrometers. So it's because you're dealing width by length, right? So this is how these eggs are measured. Now, thankfully, they're pretty large. With your HEPA filter, you're going down to what? 0.5 microns, I believe. So certainly your HEPA filter is more than enough to capture these raccoon roundworm eggs. Okay, so, but what kind of equipment do you need to have? Well, we tried to be comprehensive here as well. Here we talk about rubber gloves and durable leather and plastic bags, 3 millimeters thickness, disposable sponges, and bleach, and Tyvek-style disposable coveralls, access to water, exhaust fans, plastic sheeting, lighting equipment, first aid kit, eye protection, soap, disinfectant sprays. So it gets, again, this is something where you may want to see if you've never done this before, this may be something helpful for you to read and say, all right, what kind of materials do I need? And I would always encourage you, if you're going down this, talk to your insurance company, make sure you're going to be covered, and then start with something small and get the sense of it. And try to remember that when you're cleaning things, your outside of your garment's going to be contaminated. So you need to have an area where you're working, and then you need to have an area where you have like a change area, and then where you could go into a clean area. So where you're changing out equipment. Otherwise, you could be contaminating other areas as well. Talk about the vacuums that are going to be involved here. And based on the available science and logic, vacuuming should not be used as the primary removal method of raccoon fecal accumulations, but only as one step in a final cleanup once large debris has been physically removed. Now, some of you are going to disagree with that, and I understand. This is written in a very conservative, worst case scenario way. I know of wildlife control operators that use these large attic exhaust, I guess vacuums, I guess, for lack of a better word. They're almost a foot wide, and they're with large motorized vacuums, and they just pull all kinds of this debris and they pull it right out of the building. So all they walk into the structure with is this large hose. And they seem to have done pretty well. Maybe that's one of the areas where this document should be modified. My concern is I don't know enough about those vacuums, whether or not they're blowing those spores out into the neighborhood air. I don't know the answer to that. And I have some personal suspicions. Again, I could be paranoid in a wrong way. It could be paranoid in the right way, but I'm paranoid about this, and that is, what happens if there's a tear in that microfilter bag? What if there's an inappropriate seal in that bag? Then you have this leak that's occurring. I just don't have answers for some of that. So perhaps those of you who are listening who have maybe some industry knowledge about how those vacuums are built and whether they are sufficient, because my understanding is those large vacuums, I mean, these are huge, almost like industrial vacuums. My understanding is that their filters are not HEPA rated. Now, that's different from those backpack ones that you have in the pest control industry used to, clean up, suck up cockroaches or bed bugs or something like that. Those are HEPA filter rated. But again, much smaller in size, much more contained. It's not these large industrial size things. So those are questions that I have that I wish I could get a better answer of. And so I wrote this to be on the very conservative side, and I was hoping for feedback from the industry. Unfortunately, I didn't. There was just crickets is what I got back. So unfortunately, that's where it's at. I would love to revise this. And if some of you out there want to comment on it, I would love to receive your comments and revise this, because I wanted to make it useful for the industry. Section 10 delves into how to clean up raccoon latrines that are outdoors. And we're going to leave that for another section. So just sort of in summary, I wanted to make you all aware of this publication. It's a draft proposal for an industry protocol for the cleanup of raccoon latrines. This may even be useful for those of you that want to get into cleaning up bird droppings and things of this nature. I think it does have some analogous benefit for other types of fecal materials, but this was obviously designed simply for raccoon latrines. I would love to get your feedback on it. I hope you find it helpful. If you are already doing attic cleanouts with raccoon latrines, I would love to get your feedback from it. Perhaps you may want to read this. Maybe there's something that you're missing, because I'm waiting for the big lawsuit, perhaps, right? Something's going to happen eventually. And either we're going to be proactive in this industry and police ourselves, or we're going to get a lawsuit and something bad's going to happen. And we don't want that, right? And I don't want any of you to have to go through that. But if we're doing things appropriately in advance and we're getting that training out, we want to make sure our clients are protected and that you're protected and that we're doing the job that people have hired us to do. So again, a draft proposal for an industry protocol for cleanup of raccoon latrines. For short, you may just want to go Vantassel, cleanup of raccoon latrines. It's available at no additional charge. As I said before, it's not free. It was paid for by your tax money, because that's where my salary came from when I was at the university. So, but you don't have to pay for it again. It's freely available. And I hope you find it useful. And I think it still it would be nice to update it again, to bring it up to date with some more new information. But I would love to get your feedback from it. You can reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, or perhaps you might even want to be on the show and talk about this some more, and I would love to talk to you about that possibility as well. Well, do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to our podcast, ring the bell, then again, don't forget to join us on Facebook with our Pest Geek podcast family. We'd love to have you there and talk about your trials and triumphs and just share your work in a welcoming, warm community of the Pest Geek podcast. Well, I'm Stephen Vantassel. You've been listening to Living the Wildlife. Why? Because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everybody.